Good afternoon and welcome to this Rhodes Centre event. It's great to see you all here. We're building quite a crowd week to week. This is wonderful. Today I'm delighted to have my good friend Paul Tucker, who I've known for a few number of years now. And he's written this enormous, whopping book called Unelected Power, which is well worth engaging with. So I thought, let's invite Paul along. Paul was the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England for many a year from its transition from being a more dependent to a more independent central bank, and was on the front lines of the global financial crisis on the British side. He is now the chair of the Systemic Risk Council. Paul will talk to us for about 20-25 minutes about his book and the themes therein. We're then fortunate enough to have two very different but equally complementary discussants. So first we have Corey Brettschneider, who's a political theorist here at Brown, who's written on issues of delegation, democracy and judicial review, amongst other things. And then we also have Professor of Macroeconomics, Gotti Egertsen, who knows an awful lot about central banks because he used to hang around at the Fed. So we'll put the three of those into action. I will disappear now and I will hand over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's great to be at Brown. Actually, it's great to be at the Rhodes Centre. I'm old enough that I know Bill Rhodes, and I've known Bill Rhodes for a very, very long time. And it shows that bankers sometimes do fine things with their money. So I'm glad he's endowed a centre at Brown. My book, Unelected Power, is about whether there is a gap in our constitutional principles, small c constitution, for the structure of government. I'm going to make 3 or 4 points about what the book is really about, and I'm going to make 3 or 4 points about substance that start to connect with central banking. So in some senses, the book isn't especially about central banking. It uses central banking as perhaps the best exemplar of modern unelected government power, other than the judges, other than the military, which we will come back to. But to be a central banker today, as I was for many years, don't say this next bit with any pride, is to be very powerful indeed. And our constitutional principles don't provide any guidance for this. If you think back to John Locke and Baron Montesquieu and this country's James Madison, when they're debating the tripartite structure of government between executive branch, legislative branch, and independent judiciary, they've got no conception whatsoever of the administrative state, let alone that there should be bodies that are 3/4 detached from day-to-day government and yet wield great government power. In that constellation, central banks are unusual in 2 respects. The first is that because they can create money and because money allows them to create inflation, and because surprise inflation is a form of taxation and redistribution of resources, they latently have quasi-fiscal power. To sit in a central bank governor or deputy governor's chair is to have latent fiscal power, even though you weren't elected. The other thing about modern central banks, and since the crisis this is true of all of the big central banks, is that you are a regulator as well. You write rules and regulations that bear on banks and some non-banks. And the significance of that is, what are regulations? We talk about regulations as though they're techie things, but these are legally binding norms that can be enforced with the state's monopoly of coercive power. So the standard arguments that people make for an independent monetary authority can't carry across in a simple way to them being insulated from the elected part of government in exercising their regulatory, their lawmaking powers. If we started talking about regulators and central banks as lawmakers, that would somehow jolt us out of how we think about central banks and regulators. So the second thing is this book is an attempt to put legitimacy up there as an issue with justice. Really, since I was quite a young man, since the 1970s, when John Rawls from Harvard published A Theory of Justice, the dominant issue in political theory and in political debate has been, what does justice mean, and how should we deliver it, and how should we ensure the institutions of government conform to our principles of justice? And of course I think that's important. But I think just as important, in some sense prior, are the legitimacy of the institutions of government. A British philosopher, Bernard Williams, said that legitimacy is the first political question because it underpins the institutions through which we even begin to talk about and pursue justice. And the reason this matters is because what is legitimacy? It's amongst other things, it's what gives the institutions of government resilience. And that matters because any part of government, elected or unelected, in any field, is destined eventually to fail. And sometimes to let the people down very, very badly indeed. And the great financial crisis of 10 years ago is an example of government letting down the people and inflicting great hardship on this country, many countries in Europe, and indeed many countries elsewhere in the world. And representative democracy delivers resilience for us in a very special way, because it separates how we feel about the system of government from how we feel about the government of the day. So as government goes through time and it eventually messes up in some way, and we're all very angry, we go to the ballot box and we vote out the people that we feel have let us down or aren't competent to take us to the next stage. But that doesn't alienate us from the system of government. Well, that's only true as long as we can vote out our governors. Well, British citizens couldn't vote me out. In this country, you can't vote out Jay Powell or the people that are at the head of the other regulatory agencies. The whole point about being unelected is that you can't be voted out. And so to the extent that more and more of our government is in unelected hands, we're taking risks with alienating people from our system of government rather than just being fed up occasionally and inevitably with the government of the day. And the book is an attempt to try and find in our political values what is needed for an institutional structure to be legitimate. And so it attends to the values of democracy, the values of the rule of law, the values of constitutionalism in debating how to design and whether to delegate to independent agencies. And let me give you an example of that applies to central banking. So typically the argument for an independent central bank is that if you allowed the politicians to be responsible for interest rates, they wouldn't stick to their promise of low and stable inflation. They would try and create an economic boom and a financial boom in the run-up to an election to make themselves more popular, even if that was going to fizzle out and be costly in the longer run. And Gauti has written eloquently and formally about how you can put some rigorous economics behind that intuition. But there's another kind of argument which builds on that, but draws on our constitutional tradition. So one of our deepest constitutional values is the separation of powers between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And in my country, this was I'm English, this was a medieval struggle about taking away from the king the power to tax. And the power to tax was located in Parliament, just as it is located in Congress. And yet what is the monetary policy instrument? As I said at the beginning, it's latently an instrument of taxation, both through surprise inflation and the steady state rate of inflation. So if that's right, then it means the last people that should have control over monetary policy are the executive branch. And yet actually that was the pattern through much of Europe, and indeed in this country in the earlier part of the 20th century. And yet that was an absolute violation of our constitutional values if we are serious about the separation of powers. So assuming we're not going to set up a committee of Congress or Parliament to do monetary policy, how should we do it? Well, one route was the gold standard that we had in the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century. And I think one can see, in terms of political theory or constitutional theory, we can see the gold standard not just as an economics design thing, but also as a way of separating monetary policy from the executive branch under laws passed by Congress or by the British Parliament, in particular in the 19th century. Now, I'm going to assert that under full franchise democracy, the gold standard isn't going to be acceptable, because history shows that what it entails is quite high volatility in jobs, quite high volatility in output, and I will assert that the people are unlikely to accept the restoration of the gold standard today. Well, then what are you left with? Well, so what central banks amount to is an attempt to delegate to a bunch of technocrats who somehow we think will not cheat and use the monetary instrument as a surrogate means of taxation. I'm going to come back to that a bit later. So the book is also about technocracy versus populism. And there are lots of books about this, and most of them are about the risks of populism and how to contain it. I think one of the best is Dan Ziblatt's How Democracies Die. My book is about technocracy and populism from the other end of the spectrum. It's written from within technocracy, that's what I was, and it says technocracy should retreat a bit in the interests of our system of government. And that is not, I believe this very strongly, and I think it's not just a matter of we should see off the populists, it's that the technocrats who aspire to govern us should retreat a bit and get back into their box. And this is not a post office belief. This was a belief that I held and tried to live by when I was in office. Fourthly, the book is about the insufficiency of legal liberalism as a set of principles for designing our institutions. Why is this important? It's certainly that I don't eschew liberal principles at all, but typically there's a broad swathe of opinion, particularly amongst legal scholarship, that would say, well, Congress is going to delegate to agencies. It's going to delegate with very vague mandates. There is a risk that these agencies or central banks may abuse their powers, and it's the job of the courts, thank God, to ensure that there isn't an arbitrary exercise of powers, and that, to use Germanic language, that the decisions be proportional, that they don't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but they use the gentlest power they can to achieve their objectives. And I'm saying, yes, I agree with all of that, and it is insufficient. If we also place weight on our Republican values, small r for Republican, then it matters that the people's voice be heard and the people's legislature be heard in deciding what it is that these agencies to do. Now, this brings me to the kind of heart of the book. Typically, when people are debating whether or not we should have the administrative state, as it's called in the United States, the argument is, well, we want to harness experts. And there was a man called Landis at the Harvard Law School in the 30s and 40s and thereafter, who was one of the architects of the Securities and Exchange Commission, was chair of it for a while, was a member of the Federal Trade Commission, a great man in many respects, and wrote a book in the late 30s, I think called The Administrative Process. And he rested his case entirely on expertise. And even when he was advising President-elect Kennedy in the early 1960s, he was still focused on expertise. And I argue in the book, this simply cannot be enough, because you could set up an expert commission that was independent And what it did was it advised the president or a member of the cabinet. You could have political decision-taking based on independent expert advice. And actually, for what it's worth, British monetary policy was run on exactly that basis between the early 1990s and 1997. We weren't independent decision takers. We were independent public advisors. But that leaves you with a problem. And the problem is one I've alluded to, which is that it is very hard for politicians to keep their promises. And I gave the example earlier, the politicians will say, we're going to have low and stable inflation. But actually they can do better for themselves, because in the short run they can do better for you by allowing you, the voters, by allowing a boom, by setting interest rates too low. Whereas the technocrat, the question is, can we harness them to an objective we give them, because they essentially care about their professional reputation and their public reputation for delivering a goal. Now, if we can't do that, all bets are off. My view rests on societies being able to bestow esteem on people. Behind this is a very Republican value, which used to be called honor. I don't think we should call it honor today. I think we should call it esteem. But a society that is incapable of bestowing esteem on people is not going to work very well, not going to be very successful in harnessing technocrats to anything, because technocrats may just pursue whatever they think is the right thing to do. But if that's right, or something like it is right, then the technocrat needs to be given a clear objective so that we can see whether or not they are delivering the objective that they've been given. And this not only helps to insulate them from political interference, it helps insulate them from big business and small business and other interest groups in society. If you're one lobby and you're the other lobby, and everyone can see that repeatedly I deliver something that's in your interests over here, whereas actually my objective was expressed in terms that should have been in the middle of the room, then people can see that I was cheating. That won't work if the objective is not clear. And I say, don't delegate to independent agencies unless the objective is clear. I've got two more points to make. That's not enough. In these powerful agencies, we need to disperse power. This is a really great American value. It's not solely American, but this is associated with founding father James Madison. Our society should not be in the business of creating independent agencies with one decision taker. And so whatever by my lights, whatever we feel about the Consumer Protection Finance Bureau, it should not be independent. And that is not because I don't believe in its mandate, it's because one happened to be a man, and it's another man now, I think. It's one person is in charge of policy. That's a hell of a lot. This person has complete control over their delegated powers. They have job security, and they don't have to go to Congress for their money each year. And they've got vague objectives, so they decide policy. I mean, John Locke would be turning in his grave. I mean, at least spread power amongst a committee of people, and that does lots of things. If you have one person, one vote, you reveal where the differences are, you reveal where the disagreements are, and that enhances public debate. When I was a monetary policy committee member in the United Kingdom, and the same is true here more or less, when there's a disagreement, it's much easier for Parliament or Congress to hold hearings with you, because they can say, Mr. Tucker, why were you in a minority? Why did you think interest rates should go up and everybody else thought they should go down? If there's only one view, it is much harder for less expert politicians to find the things that they need to ask about and to generate public debate. Now, almost one final point. So, everything I've said so far would point in the direction of it being absolutely outrageous to allow central banks to be both the monetary policy maker and the regulator of banks. Because if you want to disperse power, you not only want to disperse them across the members of a committee, you want to disperse them across institutions. You don't want one institution led by an elected people, to have regulatory powers over here and monetary powers over there. And this is not just a problem of constitutional principle, it's a problem of incentives as well. There's a wonderful book by a man called James Wilson from, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago called Bureaucracy, which studies this country, and it studies the various bureaucracies of this country, and those that have many missions tend to put most effort into just the one that is most salient, and the others not quite go hang, but they underperform on the other missions. And in Gautis and My Shared World of Economics, there are famous papers by Bengt Holmstrom, who won the Nobel Prize the year before last, I think, and Paul Milgrom of Stanford, formalizing that bureaucrats, technocrats will put less effort into the less salient mission, and so will underperform if they have on some missions, if they have multiple missions. And yet the instinct of many people in my former world is essentially it's crazy to separate banking regulation from monetary policy. Crazy and dangerous. My country did separate it, by the way, and it ended rather disastrously. And I think it's crazy to do so. So what's going on? And I set out in the book conditions for combining them. And one is that if we've got these two missions, they should be intrinsically interconnected. And the public community, the politicians, should have a view that you really will achieve better results by combining them. But the third and key thing which I add is that, well, if you have two different missions or three different missions, you should have a separate policy committee for each one, and each policy committee should have a majority of members who are on that committee and on that committee alone. And this actually is how the Bank of England was redesigned in 2012 after the crisis. And this isn't a post hoc rationalization of why it was designed that way. It was designed that way for these reasons, and I know that because I'm the main architect of that design. And what I wanted to do was ensure that the governors of the day didn't concentrate on the things that they found most interesting or most politically salient, but took absolutely everything seriously. This matters enormously to central banking. So why can't central banks? Why is it crazy for them not to be the bank regulator? Because as the monetary authority, they're inevitably the lender of last resort to distressed banks, because only they can create resources in a hurry. Well, if you're at the scene of the disaster, as they almost inevitably are, you have to quote language from Paul Volcker, the greatest central banker of the 20th century, in 1990, a valedictory lecture. If you're always at the scene of the disaster, you have an inalienable interest in the stability of the banking sector. If you're the cavalry, you want to ensure that the village was well defended beforehand, and you need to know something about the village, and you need to have some kind of role in municipal planning. But you can't leave that just to the same people that do monetary policy. So concretely, there is a design fault in the Fed. There are two committees, the Federal Reserve Board for Regulation and the Federal Open Markets Committee for Monetary Policy, but everybody on the Federal Reserve Board is on the Federal Open Markets Committee. And the risk I'm talking about of concentrating on the salient issue, or the one you like best, it crystallized. Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve for 18 years, he wasn't very interested in soup and reg. Everyone always talks about Alan Greenspan's flaws being that he was a libertarian economist and so on. Actually, for me, the deep flaw was that he wasn't interested in part of the mission, and yet there wasn't anybody on the regulatory committee who was only on that committee to say, you shall take this seriously. And if you don't take this seriously, we will outvote you. I will stop there. I've left hanging a whole set of really difficult issues about how things should work in emergencies. And I think it's fair to say that there are some very senior policymakers in this country over the last 30 years who disagree with me about emergencies, who like the idea of unelected officials being the US cavalry. And maybe we can save that for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to Paul for joining us, and especially for writing this book. I should say when Mark first invited me to come speak about central banking, I thought this is really not my area. But of course, when I started to read the book, and you can see this already from the talk as well, I realized this is not your normal, typical book about central banking or about banking. I think most people might assume, and actually Paul told me that when it's stocked in the bookstores, it might be in the economics section. But what's really remarkable about this book, and the first reason why I'll commend it to you, I mean, you should all read this book, is because it really rethinks entirely the frame for thinking about the role of central banks in a democratic society. It is a work of political thinking, of political theory, and of deep democratic theory, and that's unusual for somebody who I think has played a role in government and central banks and also is trying to think about them. The usual frame that we have is of economics, of efficiency. So let me say something first of all about why the question is important. In thinking about courts, which I know many of you just looking around have taken classes with me about judicial review, we always begin with the question of why can 5 people in our democratic society, the Supreme Court, strike down laws that are passed by millions of people? Congress passes a law. I mean, think of all of the people who are involved in electing those officials and getting that legislation through. The Supreme Court of the United States has the ability to come along, and 5 of 9 people can strike down that law. That's a puzzle in democracy. We call it the counter-majoritarian difficulty. And as I'll suggest, there are answers to it. But what Paul very bravely does in the book is say, you know, the exact same puzzle exists for the Federal Reserve and for central banks like it. These people are not directly elected. Nobody elected the head of the Federal Reserve, no matter how good or bad they were. So what gives them the enormous power to make political decisions? And think of the main, or one of the main decisions that they're making. Do we value fighting inflation, or do we value fighting unemployment? That's not an efficiency question, that's a value-based question in part, right? That's about the trade-off between caring about jobs and caring about the health of the economy and inflation. So why is it that an unelected official can do that? The book, the title, Unelected Power, shows you the power of that question, and you might think from the title that the answer is, well, we got to get rid of central banks and that we should just have, you know, legislatures or parliaments making the decision. But the answer in the book is much deeper than that. Like the deep question of the counter-majoritarian difficulty and courts, Paul's argument is, even though central banks are unelected, if they play a certain role, they could potentially be not just legitimate, but centrally important to our society. And understanding the depth of the answer, why they can be unelected but also democratic, that's the challenge for the book. And the fact that he's even framing it this way, I think, is part of what makes it a real gift. So what's the answer? The first answer is you're not going to get away with pretending that there's some neutral answer to this, that efficiency or expertise is just going to be the answer. He thinks that's a kind of Platonic thing in the expertise sense that would have no authority in a democracy. And that the efficiency answer is really masking deeper questions. I take it there are multiple efficiency outcomes along the spectrum that central banks could choose. But the question of, you know, do you go after unemployment or inflation or the other kind of deep questions of how we handle the questions of the economy are value-based. So we're not going to get away with an efficiency answer the way that a lot of economists have tried to. The answer, I think, as I understand it, there are 2 deep answers, both of which I'm very sympathetic, and I think we've kind of written parallel books. A lot of what I think the answer to the question about judicial review is, this is sort of the twin, I think, answer when it comes to the Federal Reserve or the central bank question. The 2 answers are, one, and actually this isn't even available, I don't think, in the case of the court, but the first is straight delegation. Legislatures create these banks with certain laws that provide certain protections. For instance, the Federal Reserve cannot be, because of the way the legislation is set up and interpreted, actually, interestingly, you say it's not written into the text of the legislation in the U.S., but by common law elaboration of it, the head of the Federal Reserve can't be fired, for instance. And that's partly because of the delegation. But there's also, I think, a second, in a way, I think, equally important, I would even say deeper answer in the book, which is that the other reason why the central bank is legitimate is because it has a trustee relationship to the people. Partly, democracy is by the people, to use Lincoln's formulation, and that's the legislative part. The bank is set up by Congress and signed by the president through legislation. But also the banker, the committee, and the head of the Federal Reserve are charged with acting for the people as trustees of a wider interest. And they have to define what that interest is, not just in terms of efficiency, but in terms of concerns about welfare and distributive justice. So I love that answer. We're 100% together on it. And I think you could start to see the power of this idea of democracy by looking at the alternatives that are available to us. And I should say, you know, in my view, the way I would put it, which is similar language, is you have democratic procedures, yes, but the role of courts, for instance, and I'd add central banks, is also to not just receive the authorization by the people through legislation, in the case of the bank, but is to serve the deeper values that give rise to democracy in the first place. Why do we care about elections? It's because we care about the autonomy and equality of citizens and of the people as a whole. And so to serve those values can't just be to allow democratic majorities to do whatever they wish. There is a trustee aspect to democracy too. Our institutions have to act for the people. Now let me give you a very radically different idea of democracy and move it from the realm of abstract theory, and this is going to scare the hell out of you, as it should, to actual American democracy. The President of the United States over the last, this is timely, couple of weeks, has been issuing, let's call them threat gestures towards the Fed, because interest rates are higher than he might like. Now, why would the President of the United States, this particular president, care about high interest rates? Well, it might be that if you're in real estate and you owe money in loans, that the amount of money that you're going to have to pay for those loans is going to go up. Now, I don't think that's exaggerating to say that this president cares a lot about his own financial situation. Now, if he were to be able to fire the head of the Federal Reserve, those threat gestures would be a really big deal. Or if he controlled the amount of money that the Fed chair and the bank receives, those threat gestures wouldn't just be threats. They would be direct assaults on the power of that person. He might actually listen if the president said, you know what, I'm going to have to pay more money in loans, lower the rates. But because of the insulation of the Fed, both from firing without cause, and also because the president doesn't, thankfully, control the budget directly of the central bank, of the Federal Reserve, there's an independence. Now, is that bad for democracy? Think of two conceptions of democracy. Here's the president's. I was elected so I can do whatever I want, including pursue my own profit. And here's another idea of democracy. Democracy isn't just about one elected official being given power to do whatever he wants. It's about the obligation of political actors to act for the people in their interests over time, not to just do whatever an elected official tells them to do. So now you see why this isn't just some abstract thing. Now there's a very different idea of democracy. This is going to now, well, I guess, scare you even more, I think. The President of the United States is surrounded by legal advisors who think actually he has the ability to fire the Fed chair, at least some. Their theory suggests, the theory of the unitary executive, that he's right in his idea that he can do whatever he wants because he's president, because there are only three branches of government, and the Fed has to be under the control directly of one of them. So they might tell him that he can fire the head of the Federal Reserve. What's to stop him? As Paul points out in the book, there is one case called Humphrey's Executor that says that because the Fed is set up in a way that gives it independence, the president doesn't have the ability to just fire the head of the Federal Reserve. But I'm not sure that there are 5 votes on the current Supreme Court for that case. And that's the scary part. Now, what's at stake here? You start to see the danger of a president who wants to serve his own interests having total control over what is now thought of as an independent branch. And that's what the book starts to show us, right? I mean, he doesn't give this example because it happened last week. But you see the importance of a book like this. It shows that part of democracy has to be a check on executive power. Now, it's a very different theory of democracy than some have offered. some people who defend what's sometimes called a unitary theory of democracy. That's the American legalistic way to put it. If we go European, we should be comparative here. The theory of Carl Schmitt says, you know what? There has to be one leader elected by the people, that's democracy, delegated complete power to do whatever he or she wants. And that Schmittian theory of democracy is completely incompatible with the idea of a Federal Reserve. But I think the power of the book is it shows that's not really democracy. Democracy has to allow institutions that serve not just the whims of the people, not just a leader, but the independent idea that the people's interests for the people, of their welfare rights, for instance, their distributive rights, that has to matter. The stability of the economy as a whole, not just the whims of one person. Now, in the book, sometimes there's a skepticism, and this is, we're kindred spirits, but I think this is, I'll just raise some questions about this part. Sometimes you suggest that the closest analogy institutionally isn't going to be, in justification, isn't going to be courts, but it might be legislatures. It's not the same as legislative control of central banks, but the authority is delegated by the legislature, and there's a certain kind of authority there. But I guess I think that the for the people idea and the by the people idea, at some point, there's going to be a question about what's really doing the work. And so I want to make an argument for why it's the for the people idea. It seems to me that if a legislature, if the Congress, for instance, acting under the influence, let's say, of the president, tried to, say, fix rates at no more than 1% because of some belief that this will keep their party in power by juicing the economy continually, I would think that there's an anti-democratic aspect to that too. And I think what I'd pull out here is the trustee aspect of the theory, that the for the people part and the by the people might be coming apart. And to me, in that kind of instance, there's a legal question, but I'd be willing to say, I think you might be too, that really what's doing the work is the trustee idea. Because if even a Congress wanted to do that, there would be something that would undermine the basic idea of stability and preservation of the general welfare in democracy. So I don't think that I guess my view of the way the theory works in the end is, it's not that there's an analogy with any one institution, it's that the trustee model underlies any institutional idea. It's institution independent is the argument, I guess, that I get. And in that way, it is like courts, that there is a sort of idea that even though it might be acting distinct or even contrary to majorities, that it is democratic because it's acting for the people. But there's a different kind of, I would say, institutional competence. Courts are very good at certain values. Think of the protection of equal protection. Majorities might have wanted segregation during the Warren Court, but in a unanimous decision in Brown versus Board of Ed, the court strikes down segregation and says, no matter how many people want this thing, nationally or at the state level, it's unconstitutional. The deeper value of equal protection trumps the by the people desire for segregation. Courts are good at that kind of value. They're good at protecting free speech against a president or majorities that might disparage it. But what they're not great at is protecting welfare rights. They don't have the institutional competence to go out there and guarantee the idea of housing or employment or to balance concerns about inflation and employment. But central banks are good at it. And so I guess I'd suggest, just filling in a little more of at least how I read the book, that it isn't just preservation of welfare generally in the sense of maximizing welfare. It's about welfare rights as well, that the role of the central bank, for the people idea would be to guarantee not just an overall health of the economy, but to think about issues of distribution. And I think that's consistent with the spirit. You provocatively mentioned the military in the end, and I'll say one thing about why these two institutions, I think, fit better for the model that we both have of democracy than the military. You could see somebody saying to both of us, hey, look, you've just justified military coups. If it turns out that majorities are doing a bad job, maybe the military should step in and stop Trump from keeping interest rates low or from doing whatever bad thing either the president or majorities are doing. Maybe it should be the military that does this. But institutionally, there's something very scary about that, because the military, once it grabs power, might have an incentive to never give it up. So we talked before over coffee about the Pinochet example. So I do think there's something about both courts and central banks that has an institutional check on them. Courts have no intrinsic power. Their authority rests on the fact that we basically are willing to accept their decisions. And if we didn't, if we rebelled as a majority, as people against a court, I don't see where it would get its power. Jefferson, for instance, who threatened to disobey the court if it acted too aggressively, backed it down. And that's one major check on power. One check that central banks have, a major one, and I think the book is great on this, and I enjoyed the comments too in the discussion before, is if they mess up, the economy is going to not work and people are going to be unhappy. So there is an institutional objective check if you're worried that their for the people aspect won't be working. If they do a bad job, the economy might tank, and that's going to be obvious to the people that central bankers haven't done a great job. So let me sum up. The book is about unelected power. You might think from that this is like a Rand Paul attack on the Federal Reserve. I think if Rand Paul used that title, it would sort of, I could see him giving a very different talk and approach. That's not what the book is saying at all. In fact, it's saying the opposite. That yes, it is unelected, but there is a democratic justification, potentially, not necessarily available to all central banks, but potentially available to them. Partly because of delegation, and I talked about that, but also, to me, more fundamentally, because of the idea of trusteeship, that the central bank is charged with acting in the interest for the people, in guaranteeing not just efficiency, but the general welfare, or as I've put it even more bluntly, welfare rights in addition to that. Why should we not worry about that, or what's the check on this unelected body doing a bad job? There's an institutional one. If they mess up, the people might rebel. They might demand that the power is retracted, for instance, through Congress. So this is not an easy idea of democracy. It's certainly, I think, the most sophisticated thing that I've seen about central banks, because it takes head-on the problem of democracy. It doesn't shy from it or pretend to give an answer based on efficiency or neutrality, answers that, in my view, absolutely do not work. This is maybe the only book that I've seen that actually takes that problem head-on and tries to answer it. I should say in the 30s, when central banks and when the administrative state was on its rise, this was a huge topic. Lon Fuller and others really worried that this administrative state would become undemocratic. And they offered, I think, unsophisticated responses. Some of them just opposed the idea of the administrative state. But what we have here is a very sophisticated account, both in terms of somebody who has great knowledge of central banks, of how it actually operates from being there, but also of an expertise in democratic theory in a way that's able to give, I think, a terrific, sophisticated answer to the question of how can the unelected officials that run these banks be democratic? And the answer of trusteeship and delegation is both a convincing and excellent one. So buy it. Okay, thank you.
So thanks a lot for inviting me here to talk about this fascinating book. So this is a big project, 600-page project. So it covers a lot of interesting aspects of the problems of, if and why we should delegate certain tasks away from elected politicians to professional technocrats. It's a problem that, so I'm an economist, that economists have thought some about, but to some extent the answers have been somewhat unsatisfying and elusive. So hence, this is a very welcome addition to the debate that is ongoing in that. So let me just sort of start with, given my comparative advantage being an economist, let me just outlining in just a few words first how economists have tended to think about, and this is actually beautifully outlined in the book. So to some extent, I'm just repeating some of the issues that are outlined in more depth in the book. So the way economists, the classic argument for why you should give away, why politicians would be wise to give away power from themselves to an independent agency that has potentially longer term than their own, is that politicians may have more incentive to, in jargon, be dynamically inconsistent. That is, that they have incentives to create inflation just to win an election, because people may not, if they do not anticipate it, that may create a boom, and hence they might enhance their likelihood of being elected. So in case of Trump, I mean, he's not the first president that doesn't like interest rates to rise. I mean, that's one of the key, Nixon was the same. You can go to Turkey. Erdogan has been very angry about the interest rate there, leading his tirade leading to the Turkish currency crashing because they anticipated him taking over. So this is a problem you have seen across the world, that politicians have a incentive to goose up the economy for election, even if the long run, that may not pay off. A second thing connected is that given that most government issue debt in nominal currency, they have incentive to try to keep the rate on that debt low and inflate away some of its real value. And so that's one of the themes in the book, is that, central bank independence is to some extent to try to protect the value of the currency, to do away with of the incentives the government may have to try to inflate away the real value of its debt, because they prefer not to raise taxes. So that's sort of one line of reasoning, and central bank independence can be useful to try to guard against those forces. I mean, there's another force that Paul mentions and discussed in the book that relates to incentives, and often traced back to Holmstrom models of sort of principal agent problem, and that's that politicians, they may be subject to short-term election pressure, so they might have incentives to pander to public opinion, and you can sort of formalize in models that if you have a long horizon, you may be more able to withstand you may be willing to take a longer-term perspective that may be beneficial, even invest more effort into try to achieve a good outcome. The cost, of course, may be that if you appoint somebody for life, you may be stuck with an incompetent for life, right? So that's, nothing is free. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So where does the book come in? It sort of has a very nuanced and interesting discussion, not only of these. So there's a sense in which the economic literature, this is pretty limited, and it's a little bit like the drunk looking for the keys just where the light shines. We tend to study problems that we can put in a model. If you can't put in a model, we leave it to somebody else. So, you can think of this book as sort of covering some of that all area out there in the dark that nobody has really managed to put in a model. And sort of one of the issues that Paul deals with is this unelected power, is sort of trying to come up with principles or ways of trying to legitimize this notion that, yes, that we take away some power from people who elect and give it to some people that we don't elect, right? That seems inherently somewhat and demographic, and laying out several principles that may guide how we do that, and why it may in fact be sort of legitimate and even consistent with democratic principles. So I suppose that the main focus here is on central banking, where Paul has his background, and I think sort of the main criteria some of the main criteria laid out is that those tasks where you can clearly describe what is the objectives are perhaps best they might be best put into the hands of independent institution, and I think that's right, because I suppose the worst thing you do is that if you give away a task to an unelected official, then turns out to have a hidden agenda, right? So, but to the extent that you can clearly lay out what's the objective, I think that's somewhat desirable. So when it comes to central banking, I think one of the things that he tries to lay out is that the importance of setting clear objectives, inflation target might be one of them, and then he sort of I think maybe I'm reading too much into it, but this is, I guess, why we can have a discussion here later, and I'm going to try to find something to criticize. He sort of emphasized the importance of perhaps trying to lay a clear distinction between monetary authority and the fiscal authority. Okay, so that because fiscal authority essentially is deciding winners and losers, that is best left in the hands of elected officials as opposed to unelected bureaucrats. And I think here perhaps is sort of, and one of the main concern there is that, he's concerned that, the treasurer, the elected official get into the back door, into the vaults of the Fed or the banks and start printing money and inflating away their debt and, like Trump trying to goose up his, election prospects. But I think also there's a tension there. I think that's the biggest tension. And I think if we carve that distinction too strongly, I think therein lies a danger that we carve out the central bank too far away from the elected official. And I guess I just want to conclude, sort of remind people, or not remind, or perhaps inform some, is that, we're talking about central bank independence these days. And I think people sometimes tend to forget, although Paul certainly doesn't, that, after the Great Depression, the discussion was very much the opposite. And that was, of course, after the Fed completely messed up. And so to cite Milton Friedman, to paraphrase Clemenceau, monetary policy is much too important a matter to be left to the central bankers. And similarly, Paul Samuelson said that the Federal Reserve during the Great Depression was the prisoner of its own independence. So what did he mean by that? And what did they meant different things. I think what Paul Samuelson meant was, when he said it was the prisoner of its own independence, is that the Fed was sort of paralyzed in doing something to try to stem the tide of the crash because it was worried about engineering balance sheet losses. It was unwilling to intervene because it was worried about the fiscal losses, in which case, the Treasury would have to step in and it would look bad, right? In the case of Milton Friedman, he had in mind just that they were discretionary and they should set clear rules, so his concerns were slightly different. But I think if you think in the context of the current crisis, one of the things you have to say about Ben Bernanke, and it's a little bit of a criticism, a little bit in the book of the expansive role the Fed took and the Bank of England and others, is that, if you remember during 2008, the TARP legislation was $700 billion, right? And it was a huge blowback by the public that Paulson went to Congress and got all this money with the help of Bernanke and others. And I think people realized the political cost of this. So what happened in effect really was that the Fed went in. So how much did the Fed expand its balance sheet? By the end of the day, by about double that amount, over $1 trillion. Buying of mortgages, doing also all sorts of liquidity facilities. In other words, it engaged in took on huge risks on a balance sheet. So I think, and in fact, if you look at what, it took a host of policies that were actually quite inherently risky physically. So I would be worried that if we would restrict central bank independence too strongly to really say, okay, your objective is inflation, and you cannot engage in actions if they carry substantial fiscal risk, we may be, slicing it too narrowly in the sense that with interest rates as low as they are, they may not have the tools to achieve their inflation target. So I think that's the key tension in the book, and you discuss many of these issues, but I think that's sort of where the difficulty in the discussions will lie in the future when we think about how to balance these things. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Paul, would you like to take 5 minutes to respond?
Thank you, Mark. Just to first
Can you
of all,
point the mic towards you?
Yep, absolutely. First of all, thank you both very, very much indeed. If like me, you've spent 33 years as a public official and then you venture out of doors and you write a book, frankly, it's a blessing to be taken seriously at all. And I mean that. One feels different about things at different stages of one's life and career. A few thoughts. There are some law students in the room. I mean, Corey's absolutely right to make the connection between the Bickel debate about the counter-majoritarian problem and the problem that I'm discussing. And towards the end of the book, I say and I think this would be uncontroversial for economists as well, that you could, however well you do what I prescribe, you can never write down a complete contract, and therefore you need some self-restraint as well, and that absolutely chimes with Bickel's urging the justices of the Supreme Court to be self-restrained in the way that they exercise their powers. So in the background, there are always soft norms. It's like the hard norms can't do all the work. The second thing I would say in response to Corey is that when I first encountered the unitary executive theory, remember that I'm not only British but English, I thought, my God, these people could have stayed with a king if they'd wanted. A lot of bother could have been saved, and we would have been, we were fighting a world war with France at the time, and the American War of Independence can be seen as part of that. And I think the unitary executive theory is absolutely against the values that animated your revolution against the Westminster government. And more importantly than the history, concentrations of power are just a very, very bad thing, whoever holds them and however wise they are. And one of the reasons that George Washington was a great man was that twice he gave up his office, which is a hell of a thing. I would also say to you that it is shocking to an Englishman that Carl Schmitt is stocked in the bookstores and being taught again, whereas you can detach Heidegger and Paul de Man from possibly their work from their Nazi affiliation. You cannot detach Carl Schmitt's views on political theory and constitutional government from his role in the Nazi state, for which he was interviewed at least twice by the Nuremberg prosecuting authorities. I think finally they decided not to prosecute him. Of course there should be free exchange of ideas. People are free to discuss these things, but people should inhale carefully when they deal with Carl Schmitt, which many serious academics in this country aren't. I want to link something that Corey said with where Gauti ended up, and let me take this in two steps. A problem I do not pretend to solve, and I make it clear that it's a real problem, is the balance of action between the central bank and the fiscal authority. Imagine you've got a real crisis, and you've got two sets of powers. You've got a fiscal policymaker who has powers out to here, subject to constitutional constraints, but no statutory objective whatsoever, only a need to win elections, and a monetary policymaker who has kind of powers out there, which is quite considerable but not enough, isn't running for election, and but does have a clear objective. And this thing happens, and the fiscal policymaker sits around and says, well, actually, the optimal thing to do for the medium to long run would be for there to be a mixture of monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus. So concretely in this country, around 2011 onwards, most economists, or many economists, think it would have been a good thing if there had been fiscal investment in the infrastructure of this country, which would have expanded the productive capacity of the economy as well as supporting savings. But to do something like that, you face what political scientists would call transaction costs, or what normal people would call unpopularity, in your cabinet, in Congress, in your political base, and some of your media supporters. And so any sane politicians, and I've been lucky enough to know prime ministers and heads of government in a number of countries, any sane top politician would ask, what happens if I do nothing? And the advice will come, well, whether or not you should do nothing, if you do nothing, the central bank will do more. The central bank will reinvent itself as the US cavalry. And before I get to the issues that Gauti poses, I mean, at the very least, you can end up with a suboptimal mix of fiscal policy response and monetary policy response. However well you've designed the central bank, because actually it seems we can't incentivize the fiscal authority, the elected politicians, to do everything that they should do in those circumstances. The thing I would say in response to Gowdy is actually to give you a practical example, because he's absolutely right. Central banks end up taking risk, and on both sides of the Atlantic, in continental Europe and the UK, and in the States, the ECB, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve all took a lot of risk, and consciously so. We in the UK handled it in a different way. We did actually more or less the same thing in economic terms. In political terms, we did something very different. Before we embarked on what economists call quantitative easing, which is buying lots of stuff to shift money out there, because we were aware that we could make huge profits out of this, and because we were aware that we could make huge losses out of this, we asked the government for a public indemnity. Now, there was no economic substance going on whatsoever, because had we made losses, they flow through to the Treasury anyway, and either taxes have to be higher or public spending lower. But rather than it being discovered, actually so far the Bank of England and the Fed haven't made any losses, but rather than it being discovered ex post that there were losses, and suddenly everybody in Congress or Parliament goes, no one told us that they could lose money on this kind of outrage on, across the television channels, we said, put this up front, that this is risky, and that you are standing behind it, and ultimately the taxpayer is standing behind it. That's the first thing we did. The second thing we did, and the Federal Reserve didn't do this, is we said, this is a bit more technical, we said, if we buy long-term government bonds, you have to, which will pull down government bond yields, you have to promise publicly that you will not tilt the pattern of your debt issuance to issue more long-term government bonds, so as to both exploit the advantage that we're giving you and actually undo some of the economic effect. And the UK government, the UK Prime Minister, agreed to do that, and there was a public exchange of letters. This was voluntary restraint on their part. There was no such exchange in the United States, and most people, not all, believe that the US Treasury did extend the maturity of its debt issuance and did somewhat undo what the Federal Reserve did. And there's a kind of debate between Larry Summers and people say yes they did, and Tim Geithner and people say no they don't. I'm with those who say yes they probably did. But the point is that you can't disentangle yourself from the fiscal authority in these circumstances. Once you move out of the corner of doing very vanilla things, you are in the blurred fiscal space. And my position isn't that there is a clear line between monetary and fiscal written in natural law or in deep economic principles. It's that as political societies, and this is what bridges between, I now live in two worlds, the world of economics and policy and political theory, the way we cope with that is to draw lines as a matter of convention. And the people that should choose those lines should be elected, in my view, and the lines should be understood. I'm leaving on one side, I'll shut up there, I'm leaving on one side a whole set of different questions about emergencies and the question, the profound question Corey posed about for the people or by the people.
And on that, we'll open up to questions. Who wants to go first for any of the panelists? Don't all jump at once.
Well, firstly, thank you to all three for some terrific remarks, and look forward to diving into the book. On this question of for the people, by the people, I'd be curious to hear differing views with respect to the dual mandate. And obviously, different central banks have adopted different policies, with the Fed and the ECB being notably different in that respect. And then, to the extent you could also comment on your views in relation to discretion, that would be interesting as well.
Okay. So on the weighing growth against inflation. I think delegation.
Again, could you go closer to the mic, Paul?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Or pull it towards you.
Yeah, I think delegation to unelected central banks turns in part on something that nearly all economists believe, but not absolutely all, which is that there is no trade-off in the long run, that if the Federal Reserve doubled or tripled the amount of money in the economy tomorrow and left it there forever in 10 years' time or 20 years' time or whatever, however many years' time, nothing whatsoever will have happened to the level of output or the rate of growth of output and productivity growth, but the price level will be higher. And as the price level gets there, inflation will have gone up. That there's a trade-off in the short run, but that there's not a trade-off in the long run. Now, if one holds that belief, and the people delegating these powers seem still to hold the belief that the economy, well, if they concluded they didn't hold that belief, then I think in some senses it would be much more difficult to delegate these things to central banks. So long as they do, the differences between, say, the Federal Reserve, which has a dual mandate on the one hand, and the ECB that has hierarchical objectives, achieve low inflation and subject to that support the economy, which is basically what the ECB has and the Bank of England has, that there is no difference in substance. I don't think that economists believe that in any material sense the Federal Reserve acts in a materially different way from the ECB or the Bank of England. I think what is different is something else. For both the ECB and the Federal Reserve, they choose their own inflation target. The legislation sets, essentially, on the nominal side, sets an objective of price stability, and the Federal Reserve decides what price stability means, and the ECB decides what price stability means. And actually, for years, the Federal Reserve didn't really tell us what they meant by that, and now they do. And that was under Ben, and that was a very big step forward in terms of, I think, democratic values. It was also good in terms of framing expectations in the economy and in terms of economic efficiency. The system in the UK is different, and I believe better. Better not in the world I share with Gouty, but in the world I'm trying to move into with Corey. The way it works in the UK is Parliament in primary legislation sets an objective of price stability, and it says that the executive branch shall, the executive branch has no choice about this, it shall, under the law, set out what is meant by price stability. And so the inflation target of 2% is set by the executive branch, set by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, not set by the unelected people. The reason this matters is the steady state rate of inflation does actually affect the inflation tax somewhat. It also means that when you go into that's kind of deeply principled reason, it also means that when you go into the room, there is no question of members of the Bank of England committee having slightly different views of what the objectives should be, because they are not, none of them are in the business of setting objectives. The objectives have been set for them. Now, this system didn't arise by some kind of accident. It rose because we thought it was better as a matter of the incentives of committee members, that's economics, and kind of political decency. So I think the greater differences are not in whether there's a dual mandate or not, but in that other area. Let me say one more thing on the dual mandate. I know it concerns Paul Volcker greatly that some recent chairs of the Fed have tried to make out that it does matter that there's a dual mandate. But Paul would hold the view, and I hold the view, that this is just playing politics. This is just trying to appeal to certain constituencies. Because I would say that there's no evidence that they are behaving in any way that they wouldn't behave if it was just a straightforward lexicographic objective. And on the whole, I believe that Supreme Court justices and central bank policymakers should not bullshit.
I had a follow-up question about your answer to both these questions, which is, I mean, the way the theory works is, at least if I've understood it, is there's sort of two, at the theoretical level, two justifications for the democratic actions of a central bank. One is the delegation.
Yeah.
And so that fits in how
Yeah.
you
Yes,
think
I
about
didn't
the
answer
distinction between fiscal and monetary policy. But there's also a second thing, which I would have thought was more sympathetic to Gowdy's comments, which is the trustee idea. So why would you not say that, yes, the first necessary condition of democratic action by the Fed or by any central bank is the delegation by an elected legislature or parliament, but as a second matter, what should be delegated is at least some discretion to make decisions about fiscal policies such that would, you know, promote the general welfare or care about issues of welfare rights or broad egalitarian distribution. I mean, those would be compatible, you know, so you would have the delegation part, but you would also have the trustee part. Now, you know, I'll admit that the second we move from the first half of the book about the theory to how things work, there are going to be a lot of empirical,
Yeah.
you know, questions here. But I guess, at least as a principle, I would think that that would be consistent with what you said in the first half.
Gowdy, do you want to add to that, or?
My suspicion is that, especially if the problem of the zero bound keeps being a problem in coming recessions, that there will be increasing attention paid to possible delegation of some aspect of fiscal policy, especially those that could be used to stabilize the business cycle.
Yeah.
And I probably think that might not be a bad thing, even if I'm sympathetic to the view that distributional issues are probably not so well handled at a bureaucratic level. But, you know, purely sort of business cycle stabilization, to the extent monetary policy is not doing the job, they might need to look elsewhere.
So I agree with this, that I think the biggest problem that central banks face everywhere in the advanced world is interest rates are still pretty close to the zero lower bound. What's going to happen when the next recession occurs? Gowdy will correct me, but the unconditional long-run average of a recession in any 12-month period is around 15%.
Something like that.
I mean, that's incredibly high. I mean, it's, as you know, well, not to be sniffed at anyway. So it will happen, and I can remember in those early months of 2009, we were everywhere. We were bringing rates down from about 5% to around 0%, pretty damn quickly. Well, if you start at 2, you just haven't got as much as you can do, and they're not even at 2 in continental Europe. So, in a way, I'm very surprised that there isn't more debate in policy circles about this. And if the fiscal policymakers won't act qua fiscal policymakers, central banks are going to find themselves buying all sorts of things and doing all sorts of things which further blur the distinction between monetary policy and fiscal policy. I guess what I feel about distributional issues is that it's important to distinguish between distributional effects and distributional choices. And I don't know whether we part company here. What I want to avoid is unelected people going into the office and saying, right, what we'll do is we'll choose to make the people on this side of the room better off than the people on this side of the room, because actually it's our objective. You know, we've decided that would be nice. That would be right to make these people better off because they start off poorer or something. I think that is not the same thing at all as central bank actions having distributional effects. For what it's worth, I think my former world, including when I was in office, that we were slow to admit, if you like, that the measures we were taking in 2009 onwards were having distributional effects. Basically, pushed asset prices up, good for the rich, pushed the economy up, good for the poor, who would otherwise have lost their jobs, not so good for the people in the middle who rely on income from savings. This has been especially controversial in Germany, and I think we were slow to be open about that. And I think even now, central banks are kind of being defensive about it, I would rather than say, no, it is having these effects, or some better description of the effects. But that's not because we're coming into work and we're trying to help some people and hurt other people. We're actually trying to get the economy going and we're the only people in town, sadly, and these are the only instruments that we have got. Where does that leave me on for the people, by the people? I like the trustee metaphor very much, but the settler I see as being the legislature. So then I think the deeper question is, what happens when the legislature has gone off the rails? And it's, I'm not sure I answer this question. It's what this is the worst version of the emergency question is what happens when the elected branches are all not acting or acting badly, and you are the only people who will do the decent thing. And I think in some respects I duck that question. My answer to it is twofold. First of all, that I want as much contingency planning doing as possible. One should imagine the imaginable and prepare for it and codify it as much as possible. In other words, to the extent that what my tribe did in 2008, 9, 10 was unscripted, and it was, there's no excuse for the similar actions ever being unscripted again, because you now know what the script looks like and you can adjust it from experience. Then there is what's happened when you haven't scripted something, and I make a distinction in the book. This is the emergency debate between two kinds of things. One is you are within your legal powers, but you're going to do something which no one has ever remotely contemplated that you would do. But now it's in your mind, it's clear it is within your legal powers. And the best example of this I can think of is negative interest rates in Switzerland. And when they did it, people, my God, negative. I mean, regular people, economists went, yes, of course, negative interest rates. Normal people and business people and politicians. And my view on that is, if you're going to do something that's within your legal powers, but hasn't been remotely contemplated, you ought to find out whether the political authorities are basically with you. That's short of giving them a veto, and certainly not a right of initiative. But they're not going to. You ought to know if they're going to think it's absolutely outrageous. So when Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, saved Europe, I think it would have been better if, in some grown-up version, I'm not going to phrase it in a grown-up way, he had gone to the Council of Ministers in intergovernmental mode and asked them, would you like me to rescue the euro area? Because that's essentially what he did. The more difficult thing is, well, what happens when actually you're beyond your legal powers, but latently you have the capability still to save the nation? Now, there are people, I associate Eric Posner in Chicago and Adrian Vermeulen in Harvard with this view. Well, nevertheless, you should just carry on and save the world. And I know very senior policymakers in this country who would say, well, in those circumstances, you probably do need to act. And the Posner-Vermeulen view is, and Congress will make a lot of noise afterwards, but they'll let you do it, and the court will turn away, and you will have saved the world. This is kind of central banks as saviors of the world. And I think this is a pretty hazardous endeavor. And this is not something I can demonstrate. This is essentially a personal view or prediction about how the public will respond. I think if crises come along every 80 or years, you get away with it. I think if they come along, if there's another one in a few years' time, I think the public's taste for being rescued by unelected people, given that there are always some losers as well as some winners, even when you've rescued on aggregate, is not to be taken for granted. I think elected people should make those judgments. And so what I would like is the elected executive branch to have a delegated power from Congress, Parliament, to extend the powers of the central bank in those circumstances. And I debate that, I think, reasonably carefully in the book. What I don't debate, and duck, if you like, is, so what happens when they won't do it? Because actually they're bad. They're mad and bad. And yet, what should you then do? And I don't know the answer to that question. It's Because a formal answer to your question would be you should stick with government by the people as long as you possibly can. And the question is, what's your threshold for which you flip to government for the people?
Thank you for sharing your thoughts today. I actually had a question on the issue of unelected power and the central bank system of the European Union, actually, and on whether you think a system like that grants the ECB greater level of autonomy because it's not serving the interests of one particular government or state, or whether it actually just makes it more inefficient because it can never act in the interest of all states it serves.
Oh, the ECB, are you European yourself?
I am. I'm from Spain.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the ECB is quite different from the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, National Bank of Switzerland, all of the others. And something I say in the book, and this is not just a theoretical point, that the ECB does something cannot, in my view, warrant it for other central banks. The ECB is different in two respects, both of which are really important. The second one probably even more important than the first. The first is that it is created by a treaty, and to amend its mandate or repeal its mandate would require unanimity of the member states, 27 in the future, including the member states who are not part of the euro area. And in some of those member states, it would require a referendum So that is, although not formally the case, that is as close to an immutable constitutional provision as you could get. This is like the democracy clause in the German basic law. It ain't going to be changed. And so it is quite different from the Federal Reserve, which Ben Bernanke described as being, not exactly his words, but a creature of Congress, or the Bank of England, which is, its powers are delegated by the UK Parliament. I think this affects, not in such a good way, I'm afraid, the quality of the testimony to the European Parliament. There's nothing like testifying to the people who can take your powers away. And Mario Draghi is a great man and a good friend of mine, but I don't quite feel that he approaches that in the same spirit as dealing with the people who are the principal and can remove the power. That's all a pretty big deal. I don't think it's as big a deal as where I'm going now. All of the examples we've been exchanging implicitly assume, because we all live in countries where there's a complete constitutional setup. There's a parliament, which has fiscal powers, and an executive branch and a judiciary. Well, there is no fiscal power federal fiscal power in the European Union. And therefore, this goes absolutely to Gaudi's point. Therefore, if there's any central bank in the world that is going to have to reinvent itself as a fiscal authority, it is the ECB. And this goes to a flawed design of the monetary union, and we could talk a bit about that. But I think that Mario Draghi and his successors are essentially the existential guarantors of the existence of the euro area. I mean, I'm now, having said one shouldn't do it, I'm going to deploy Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt has this view that she or he who is sovereign is the person who will decide in emergencies, which I think is kind of a pretty silly view as a universal principle. But the ECB is close to being the economic sovereign because it is the only body capable of rescuing the euro area and therefore the European project under duress. And I think that there are all sorts of economic issues around that, but I think constitutional reform is needed to reduce the burden, technical burden and political burden on the people who run the ECB, all of whom Gauti and I know. And I think I would say that although they wouldn't use the same words as me, these are men and women who are immensely conscious of the immense burden they carry, and it's quite different from running the Federal Reserve or running the Bank of England.
We're just about out of time. Does anyone have one more question? Right over on the edge.
On the question of by the people, for the people, one of my concerns is any policy you make is going to have distributional consequences. You know, what you want to do with the rate of inflation is going to affect whether you're favoring creditors or debtors, just as an example. So two concerns that I have are, A, how do you define the people? How do you decide these interests are going to be the ones that we favor in this policy decision, and how can you justify that under the guise of we are helping the people? And also, I had a second part, but it slipped my mind, so I'll just end there.
Now, well, interrupt as I'm answering a question, and Corey and Gary should come in. So narrowly, this is why I liked in Britain the executive branch and the.
Can you go closer to the mic again?
This is why in Britain I liked the executive branch under a power given to them by Parliament determining the inflation target rather than I and my colleagues determining the inflation target. So, something I argue in the book is that this doesn't cut across what Corey said, is that you should broadly aim for these technocrats to be doing efficiency kind of things, but with distributional effects and equity choices to being made by elected people. And that's the kind of standard thing in the economic political science literature. But what counts as distributional is a political question itself. One wants the question of what's political with a capital P to be decided through politics. And, you know, 50 years ago, gender issues wouldn't have been seen as distributional. In my country, 200 years ago, here, tragically, rather more recently, issues of race wouldn't have been seen as distributional. It's possible that some of you will live to see things as being considered distributional that aren't considered now. These are not. What counts as a distributional consideration is not for someone like me sitting around talking to Ben Bernanke or Mario Draghi. You need, but by the same token, I think you need people that are having distributional effects to be open about it. There is a broader issue which I think ducks the fall by question, which is a big problem with the administrative state, which is, let me make it concrete again for those of you that are lawyers would know this. The executive order that gives guidance to the executive agencies and beyond in this country, how to do cost-benefit analysis, says you ought to take account of distributional considerations. But actually, I mean, to the extent that anyone's researched this, no one describes how they do that at all. There's a lovely paper by Dick Zeckhauser and others up in Harvard about some healthcare issues where you can't see that people actually are taking account of distributional issues, or if they are, it's completely opaque. And so a worry I have, I think I discussed this in chapter 3, is if we want to make these distinctions between efficiency and equity, we need there to be much more openness about what the distributional effects of the policies are. I do not want someone like me to take those decisions, but that isn't the same as saying that someone like me wouldn't do things with distributional effects, because I've been told to get the economy going, and this is the only tool I've got, and when I use it, it has distributional effects. I think that's different, but I accept that these distinctions are subtle, and I think there is a burden of responsibility. I almost regard it as a moral obligation on elected officials to kind of make all of this as comprehensible as it can possibly be, and essentially precisely the spirit behind your question.
I guess one thing I'd add is I think, you know, what's great about the book is that you're laying bare all of these very real issues that I think many people, frankly, have written about and have worked in central banks are just hiding from. But I do think, I guess it might be a slight, not a disagreement, but I think I'm trying to say that in a way you've let the genie out of the bottle, which is that there are these distributional questions because the effect is there. And I guess what I'm suggesting, which you don't quite want to go all the way there, is, why not go all the way and say, yes, part of the role of the bank is to take a certain position about distributive justice. Now, you say, that's not for me, but I guess I'd answer that by saying that can be delegated through the democratic branches.
If they delegated, yes, I should have said this earlier. If they delegated it in a way that said, here's what we want you to do, you are to help this side of the room against that side of the room.
Right.
I think
Then
that's
you
I think that's absolutely fine. I mean, Gowdy will be familiar with the kind of Alessina Tabellini papers that lie in the kind of more economics part of my book. And in discussing that, I reached the conclusion that central banks are in some respects closer to social security agencies than they are to the agencies in the middle. What do social security agencies do? They take a set of quite detailed policies from Congress or Parliament and they implement them. They've been told to administer distributional justice. I have no objection. I'm not sure I personally want to be involved in doing it, but that's hardly the point. I have no objection in Congress or Parliament saying, when you're pursuing monetary policy, you ought to help this side of the room. And we will measure your helping this side of the room in the following ways. What I want to avoid is zero guidance, and I go in and I say, oh yeah, I'm going to help men. All right, I'm going to help, white men or whatever, or people that are good at soccer, or something like, you can make the choices absurd. But if you look through history, people in government have made absurd choices. So it's, and more at a higher level of abstraction, what I want to avoid is, even if it's unavoidable, because both of you are coming at this in the same place in a sense, even if it's unavoidable that eventually you end up doing some of that equity stuff, I want to argue that doesn't legitimize doing it when you don't need to. That it should be something that an unelected official retreats to when all of the other branches of government fail, rather than come into the office, who should we help today? Oh God, it was soccer players, gone off soccer. We really need to help cricket players. Now actually, if the Fed helped cricket in America, that would be a fine thing, but
Gary, do you have a final comment that could help cricket in America? Or something else?
Not at this stage, but I'll ponder.
And with that as our final word, thank you very much.